So welcome everybody. This is the session number 13 of the office hours, and today we have as a topic for the initial conversation the the SocGen transaction, which which has just received actually the last risk assessment provided by the team present here, and we are here to talk about that transaction and the next steps, what is still upcoming for this implementation, and of course to hear questions from from the audience and commentary. So I'm running a little bit out of voice, but Christian or Eric, I think Eric, if you would like to give a little bit like a flavor on the transaction, given that you've worked the most on it, please feel free.
What's you, Eric? You there?
Sorry, yeah, sorry. I'm still trying to get coffee going. Well, what was the question?
You can start the conversation on SocGen.
I guess, do people have anything specific they'd like to talk about SocGen? It's a big topic. I could just, there's a lot of different ways this could go. I mean, we just
Why don't we start at a high level and just kind of
Yeah.
give an overall, and then we can maybe talk about a couple of the not peculiarities,
nuances,
nuances, and some of the, actually more important, maybe some of the learnings.
innovations.
Yeah, and learnings that we had. I think that's probably a better.
Yeah, I'll talk about it, see at a high level. So we the proposed debt ceiling here, and this hasn't been approved by the governance vote, but I'll tell you the proposed terms and talk about it as if it's coming. It'll be 30 million DAI, only 5 basis points of stability fee. And this is really experimental facility. If it's going to get bigger, we'll certainly reprice, with more on market, especially since market rates have gone up. This will be a revolving facility, so they can draw, a number of times. I mean, what they really want to do at the SG Forge SocGen subsidiary is kind of test the pipes, if you will, see if this works. They can prepay it at any time if they want to. We can call it at 30 days notice just as well, which I don't think we would do unless we see some problems. It's got some valuation triggers because the 30 million facility is going to be backed by, what do they call them? Covered bonds. SocGen issues these things called covered bonds. That it's an interesting European, what do you want to call it, a debt instrument, where if you hold a SocGen covered bond, you have 2 sources of protection. One, SocGen is obligated to make the payment to you. It's their loan, and they're a single A rated entity, so they're a big, strong bank. And 2, if they somehow can't make that payment, if the corporate entity's in financial distress, i.e. insolvency, then there's this pool of assets on their balance sheet, i.e. the covered bond, that you will have direct recourse to. And these are high caliber French home loans. So there's about almost a $50 billion pool of these. And then they issue all these covered bonds against the overall pool. And there's different like issuances of 500 million or $1 billion, and they all have kind of a pro rata claim to that big pool. And this stuff in euros is actually rated AAA. So first of all, you're backed by SocGen's corporate credit on in the collateral, and second, you're backed at a AAA level in euros on the French home mortgages. So it's very good collateral. There's definitely some structural nuances here. And in fact, on that note, Christian, why don't I defer to you a bit, because there's a lot going on here, and I think we should also, we want to be flexible and take this discussion the way people want to go. There's a lot of different parts that we could run down different rabbit holes, and we're happy to. But on that, I'll give Christian the baton.
Yeah, thank you. So I think, from a structuring standpoint, in some sense, it's fairly straightforward. There are a couple of uh, there's certainly one innovation which I like, and it was actually courtesy of SocGen. It was in their original proposal. I think works great for an entity like SocGen, which is, everybody knows who SocGen is. So if everybody knows who SocGen is, you can figure out the type of institution that this would work with. And that is the use of an instruction. So what we've done is Maker's, if you will, touch point in the real world is going to be through an entity called Dice Group, which is it's a French company. And Dice Group will be kind of acting as Maker's agent, both in signing the loan agreement, signing the pledge agreement, and kind of acting for and on behalf of Maker in the real world. And one of the challenges in real world finance, and for me, and what makes it interesting, is how a decentralized protocol that is making DAI available through a vault, to which it makes open for other, for a borrower, but the borrower actually accesses, how does that software protocol and the community associated with that software protocol actually have a, if you will, a voice in the real world? And that's it's an interesting question, actually. And SocGen came up with this concept of an instruction. And like I said, I think it works for SocGen. It probably work for a JP Morgan or, a large bank like that, which has got huge reputational issues. But basically, the instruction will be approved by Maker governance, and Maker governance will in effect ask Dice Group to, act as the agent for, in effect, the Maker token holders, i.e. the Maker community. So that's one innovation that I think this deal has brought. The other thing that for me, I think was really, really helpful, and I'll give credit to my friends at CES, and a shout out to those that are here. But the folks, we worked very closely with CES and frankly SocGen to actually understand, and CES understood it, I didn't, and SocGen didn't, how the smart contract piping works, and the flow of funds and who calls what function and who does what, and the relationship between the various parties in kind of accessing vaults, having DAI go from one place to the next. And as part of the overall transaction documents, we have created something called a run book, which I'd never seen before, but it's basically an Excel spreadsheet that is, if you will, an idiot's guide. And the reason I call it an idiot's guide is because I can understand it. And that was kind of the basis of me forcing Miguel and the CES team to put it together. It was like, okay, if you can explain it to me, then it'll work. So it's an idiot's guide to how Dice Group / SocGen / the Maker vaults actually interact. And it was a really collaborative process between us, because then we had to begin to think about how to reflect that process in the agreements. SocGen, who had to understand how it worked, and then Dice Group, who needs to understand how actually to operate it. And I have to say, CES did a really good job kind of going through it with me line by line. And I think they will have appreciated, because then I was, raising questions and identifying issues for them. But, we actually created, I think, a very useful understanding of how Maker works, so that when you go to another institution like a SocGen and you have a similar structure, that there's kind of that baseline that you can basically explain to a counterparty how they access DAI. So that was, I think, a very, for me, kind of the highlight of the deal, just that collaboration between us, risk, legal, CES, working together with SocGen and Dice Group to kind of help them understand how the system works. The other thing, and I do point this out in the risk memo, the other thing that's a little different about this deal, not the deal, but the security is the pledge. So we, Dee's group on our behalf will have a pledge over the OFH token. So that's the token, the digital asset that represents these French covered bonds that SocGen has tokenized. We will have a pledge over, but typically in a pledge, like if you had a pledge over shares, for instance, share certificate, as the creditor, you would receive the share certificate and then a transfer certificate signed in blank, such that if the borrower was ever in default and you ever had to exercise on that pledge, you've got the shares, so possession is 9/10 of the law, and then you've got the share certificate that you just fill in your name because it's already been signed by the borrower. And then you go to the company registry and say, hey, thank you very much. Here, I'm the new owner of these shares, and you basically take the shares away from the borrower. That's what's called self-help, so that you as the lender basically help yourself to the pledge when the borrower has defaulted. SocGen didn't feel entirely comfortable with us, this amorphous maker community having access, or through Dee's group having access to the keys, to the tokens. So while Dee's group is registered as the owner of the tokens, or as not the owner, but as the
representative,
the pledge of the tokens, we don't actually have the self-help. We can't, we don't have the keys to actually transfer the tokens to ourselves. And that's okay because it's SocGen. And I think, frankly, we got comfortable that SocGen was not going to, the reputational risk for them not handing over the pledge was fairly high. And in the unlikely event that there was an issue, at the end of the day, we have the ability to go to a French court and say, hey, look, this is our pledge. We have the rights. Please, French court, ask SocGen to give us the keys. And we're fairly confident that that will happen. So it's not the self-help remedy that you would customarily see, but it doesn't mean we're not without remedies. It's just a little bit of a delay. Again, because of who SocGen is, it was, and the experimental nature of this transaction, we felt that was a risk worth it was certainly mitigable, and one that we thought we could take. So that was a small.
Hey, Christian, can I jump in on one thing? I want to make sure people are aware that SG Forge, which is a SocGen subsidiary, is dedicated to crypto asset innovation. And so the pledge, or as I said, there's this $50 billion pool of French home mortgage or home loans, not mortgages. And there's like 40 million of covered bonds outstanding in different issuances. 2 years ago, they took about 40 million euros into a specific issuance. And that's what we're covered by. But what was, I think, very interesting is this is a digitized on-chain issuance that's recognized under French law. They call it dematerialized notes. Not quite sure what that means, but French law has actually recognized this covered bond that is, supported by SocGen, and also it's got the underlying home loans. And you can take that key, if you will, on the chain. If you have the chain, you've got ownership rights to it. I think as Christians talked a lot about, rightly, how they didn't put that in our vault. Down the road at scale, we're hoping something like that could go into a maker vault, to get beyond an experiment. But I think this could be a key issue, is how would you get a large scale real world asset manager or bank comfortable giving any one of us on the chain, the keys to some massive amount of assets when we finance them. Because it brings up a lot of interesting issues, and we need to get there. But they're going to be very much aware. Probably they have no legal rights in a certain sense. So if we say we're not going to give it back to you, I think I can see why they're a little, a little careful about how they go about this. But ultimately, and I don't quite know the path, but to make this work at scale, we're going to have to be able to get a hold of assets in a more secure way and efficient way to control the pledges.
There was a question, is there not a multi-sig solution for this case? Sorry, I laugh because sometimes I joke about me being an old traditional finance lawyer, and this is one of those things that I clearly show my old traditional finance lawyer hat. Maybe the answer is there is on the next stage, maybe there is a multi-sig. I think we'd have to look into it. I think the other thing, and my good friend Miguel has joined. So Miguel, I'm going to put you on the spot from CES. But one of the other things that we looked at with SocGen is them actually putting their token into the vault itself. I mean, that would have been the I guess for us, I guess the best solution. But their token wasn't compatible with our vault, so we kind of adopted the more standardized MIP-21 approach. And I think one of and the CES team can talk more about this, but there had been a lot of discussions with SocGen about how to just compatibilize, if that's a word, make their token more compatible with the Maker Vault. And I think SocGen recognized that, okay, in this particular experiment, let's get the experiment working, see that, as Eric said, the pipes work. We understand who does what. We understand the kinks in the system that we need to get out. But then because SocGen's got lots of these, right? They've got lots of French covered loans that they can digitize. And there's lots of other assets theoretically out there that they could put on chain. How would we tokenize those assets that are how can we tokenize those assets such that they are a bit more compatible with the Maker Vault? So Miguel, I think you're there. I don't know if you want to say anything about the compatibility issue and just kind of the discussions that you've had. I see you've joined, but maybe you don't want to speak. I don't know if Nikolai's there. Maybe. Anyway, so I think the compatibility issue will be something that we worked around, and we will continue to look to innovate with SocGen. And frankly, the fact that the token wasn't compatible, frankly, gives us a lot of learnings as well. And as I started off with the presentation, I mean, it was a very good learning. It was a good learning experience, and it's a more hybrid deal than we've seen to date. In the context that you do have potentially an asset. Well, you do have an asset that's tokenized. It just doesn't work in the Maker vaults, but that tokenized asset is then backed by underlying real world assets.
Hey, Christian.
Yes, sir.
I'm not going to get technical, but at a really high level, we were highly encouraged because they had a token, and this was unusual for an institution to come with us with a token. So one of our first go rounds was like, wow, how do we actually use the token, right? This is the step in the direction that we want to take, and just not move TradFi to DeFi, but we actually want to do, the automation and integration. So that was the initial attempt. And then as we got into it, it was very clear that at this iteration, like Christian said, was probably not going to work. So we took a little bit different approach to be able to utilize what's called the dummy token inside of the MIP-21. And so the promising part about all this is that it's definitely a step in the right direction as it relates to more tokenization or securitization of assets, and in a real world sense, and bring them onto the blockchain. So we iterated because we felt it was necessary, and also for our learning up front to spend a couple of iterations in development to see what was possible. So, and we all knew it was an experiment. It was a very low debt ceiling. They were onboarding, and both sides were pretty excited about the opportunity. So, I think what we came up with was a great solution for this iteration. And I think the next one that comes will be, well, we even have deeper integration into the protocol. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Thank you, Mike Garish.
Christian, wait, let me ask one thing. Maybe it's a Christian and or monkey question. If their token would have integrated into our vault, would that have actually given us the key and the right to grab the collateral if they didn't make their payment? Would we actually be there where we control the collateral purely on the chain?
Yeah, that's a great question, because then, you know, if we have the token, then we have if it's a regular ERC20 with supporting all the normal standard ERC functions, then we have a lot of parameters we could set on that token, and also liquidations, right? So we don't custody it. So it's very clear to understand that the Maker protocol does not custody, and I don't think we ever will. So just keep that in mind. But the vault could potentially give us additional rights and parameters to be able to set in order for us to have more, not so much control of the token, but to be able to take and initiate different things like liquidations.
Okay.
Like
so,
we do with
we're making progress, but there's definitely more steps to go.
Yeah, there's a lot of consideration, because then, you know, because there are, I believe there's a whitelisting as far as who can actually own these tokens.
Right.
So even if you were to move into a liquidation scenario, you'd have to be able to identify most likely a third party to then, you know, custody those tokens and then do something with them.
Christian and I wouldn't qualify for that list, I'm sure.
I mean, you also have a whole nother universe of problems there, which is when you have, let's say we did custody the token, what does that even mean, right? In some sense, a token is a representation of some underlying asset. If the token gives you by law ownership of that asset, that's one thing. But none of what we've done so far, from what I've seen, is that. Because especially in the States, if by law a token gives you access to underlying cash flows, you got a security, right? So obviously in France, it'll be a little bit different. Switzerland allows you to tokenize assets in a way I think that is unique in the world. But to me, there's only there are very few assets, at least in the States, whereby a token gives you legal right to the underlying, which is a whole nother can of worms.
Yeah. And I agree with that, Tej. And I think that when David Kretz and I have been talking with various counterparties and really wanting to promote tokenizing assets, what that means, it's hard in the States. I mean, to me, the assets that you can tokenize the easiest today are probably intangibles to begin with. Right. So like, for instance, a receivable. Okay, a receivable is just a piece of paper that says I owe you. Well, you can have that piece of paper, I owe you, in digital form, and the parties recognize that I owe you is in digital form. Yeah. That's entirely different than, you know, the land that your house is sitting on, or, you know, a condominium is sitting on, you know, where you actually have to go to the land registry to have actual title. Or, you know, for instance, your car, right? Your car needs to be registered with the state. You know, unless states register car title digitally, that it's transferable, you're going to need to have that piece of paper. I mean, I had to have that piece of paper when I moved to Maryland and showed them my title, right? I had to have that piece of paper. But where it's like maybe a promissory note too, you could have digital. Anything that can be really considered an intangible that doesn't require a state to verify its existence, theoretically you could be able to.
Yeah, so I won't derail this too much. I think your point about intangible assets is really good. In fact, intangible assets are uniquely equipped to live on crypto rails, right? So think carbon units. I think carbon units are another great example. we'll be talking to Flow Carbon at Centrifuge soon. Like that's an asset that doesn't already live in a property registry, right? It's a digital asset. What does it really mean? It's amorphous. Perfect. Let's pop it in a token. I think the other piece is to your point about an asset, a physical asset already living in a registry elsewhere. And if you're tokenizing it, you're just pointing to a registry. You don't have any rights in that other registry. That's a problem, right? But for example, if you had residential real estate, right? Residential real estate was owned by an SPV, you tokenize the equity in that SPV. You could potentially have ownership to the underlying while avoiding securities laws, because you could reasonably say this token represents ownership in this residential property. You could say it's a consumable asset rather than an investment contract. So there are interesting things you can do there, but in general, it's very complicated to do still.
As everybody on the call can see, me and the real world finance team like thinking through all of these issues because there's lots of possibilities, and we do see lots of really interesting things coming our way. But I guess back to SocGen, does anybody, oh, I see somebody had a hand up.
I have a question.
I can.
So I just want to be clear on what we would achieve if their token had been compatible with a vault and we were holding this token in the vault. Is it really just like kind of a transparency and just would help our mechanics or our workflow?
I mean, nice to have versus essential with real rights.
Well, just in concert with the conversation we're having, that it's not like having their token, if it was ERC in our vault, means, you know, we're in a better position, like we can't just like liquidate that token, we can't just sell it, right? So what are we actually achieving having it in a vault versus the status quo?
Well, I think it does count. I mean, I think two things. One is the token is illiquid to begin with, right? So, you know, if we ever had to exercise on the pledge, our ability to actually sell it on the market's probably going to be limited. But we know we're going to get paid, right? These French loans are going to get paid off and we'll get paid. So it's just a matter of waiting for the time. So in that sense, you're right that if it was purely tokenized today, there is on-chain, maybe greater on-chain visibility, but in terms of transferability, we're still probably going to be limited. But you can't have on-chain transferability unless you get it on-chain. So the first step in that process will be to bring it on-chain in a way that's ERC 20 compliant, and then, you know, see, okay, maybe in, you know, a year, 6 months, 2 years, there'll be a digital market for these types of assets that we would actually be able to liquidate it.
Christian,
so it doesn't solve it entirely today, but it's a step in that direction.
Christian, this specific token doesn't cash flow until 2025. If for some reason this token, you know, paid all of its cash in 6 months and we got it in 3 months in our vault, then could we just, if we could have got it in our vault, could we hold it for 3 more months and then the cash arrives? Or not? Assuming we don't have to sell it, we can hold it to cash flow out. Would that work?
I'm sorry, is that a question for me?
Yeah, it's a question. Yeah, or maybe a Robert. Or if it was compatible, would it actually give us the cash flow right? So as long as we're willing to hold it till maturity, we get the full set of cash flows coming out of it.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. If it was a liquid token and we had ownership and rights over it,
yeah, it doesn't have to be liquid.
We would get the cash flow.
Liquidity doesn't matter. It just means if we hold it, are we entitled to the cash flows that SocGen will eventually pay for it? Did it come from the collateral?
I would, well, so that's an interesting question. I'd say yes and no. So we would be entitled to the cash that came out. Remember, the cash that's coming out is in euros, not in DAI. So we would, you know, the ideal token would actually be one that's denominated in DAI and is paid in DAI, because yes, we're entitled to cash flows, but unless you built in the structure of euros to convert it into DAI, and then
we'll have FX swap NFTs.
Oh, no, but Christian, but if we're actually guaranteed the timely payment of cash flows, even in euros, then it's something we could work with, because you could hedge that if you're certain.
Oh yeah, no, I'm saying that's why I said yes and
That's
no.
a whole lot easier to work with. It's only a timing issue. It's not a
Correct.
legal question. Do you actually get the cash flows? That's
Correct.
a much better situation.
Yeah, no, you and I are saying the same thing. I was getting into the practical mechanics of it. Any other questions about SocGen or anything else we're doing?
Well, that's where this is going, hopefully, right? Where, the banks will have their own programmers and will be programming these digital assets, and this issue of the debt being denominated in euros and, on-chain currencies, that at some point all of this technology can talk to one another. And well, I mean, will they ever go there? Because they're like putting themselves like out of business by.
I don't know. They might. Banks are good at reinventing themselves. 50 years ago, before disintermediation, they made all the loans in the economy, and now a lot of the loans are made in the securities markets. They've been disintermediated, but they still stay in the middle and clip fees for this and that. So I still think the banks will find a way to survive. It'll just be a little different. I mean, I'd like to think we get rid of them all together, but I think that's naive.
And I do think, Kianga, to your point, I mean, I think for Maker, and I can't really speak to SocGen, but I think we've developed a very good working relationship with the technical, legal, and commercial team at SG Forge. And I think that those, dare I say, personal relationships with people, and just kind of going through the run book, going through the loan agreement, going through the instruction letter, being on calls with their lawyers, just working through the who is Maker, how does it work, how does the governance process work, because those were all the questions they had. I mean, we're trying to figure out their token, and they're trying to figure out how Maker works, and how we describe that in the agreements, and how they can get comfortable with it so they can explain it to their management. We can't forget that SocGen's a big organization, right? Everybody's got a boss, and they're going to have to explain it to their management. It's going to have to go up the corporate chain. And I think the fact that we've gone this far with them, and gotten to a point where we've the pledge isn't done yet, but we're 99.9% there, right? That we felt comfortable. We knew what the pledge was going to say. To publish the risk assessment, I think, shows that we've really made good progress as Maker having a relationship with an institution like SocGen, and showing that we're able to do a deal. And I think that that's just going to open up lots of interesting doors. I hope within SocGen, and perhaps
you've inspired them as human beings, and that maybe some of that can trickle throughout their organization about how to do what they do a little bit differently.
We've actually started speaking about them with another potential digitized product. Maker has a bunch of liquidity it wants to put in short-term, high-yielding bonds. We mentioned that to them, and they actually have they got like a money management program. So you can get an overnight interest rate, which is about 1% right now. They've actually got a digitized version of that, which we've been too busy, but we want to spend some time looking at. So is there a quasi on-chain way of doing that with them? Again, I think it could be interesting innovation. I'm not saying we'd be like, hey, put $1 billion in there. You'd have to figure out how solid is it, but it would be nice to do something, again, innovative with them in addition to this.
So Dhruv, I see your question. Let me take a shot at answering it. So I think one of the things that one of the risk, so these, because the tokens are not tradable, and there's no, there is actually an oracle, we just don't have access to it. You can find, maybe it's not even these tokens, but we have a comparable token that we measure it against, because that comparable, because this token's not traded, we said, okay, well, how do we know what its value is at any particular time for purposes of the valuation metric? And we, working with SocGen, found a comparable bond. So basically pretty much the same term. And that bond basically serves kind of as the benchmark for purposes of the collateralization ratio. So so I think I'm trying to answer your question, because you mentioned both the smart contract and then you asked about the collateralization ratio being less than 140. The way that the collateralization works is collateralization ratio is actually 115%. And what we've done is we've said, okay, at 120.
Christian, do you want me to do this? This
Yeah,
might be my thing. Yeah,
okay,
sure.
sorry.
This is kind of a little more financial.
It is your thing, but I wrote it, so I know it's in my head. Go ahead.
So yeah, first of all, as Christian noted, this underlying $40 million token is not liquid. SocGen owns the whole thing. I don't think anyone else would easily buy a dematerialized whatever note this is. But there is another covered bond that I think is $750 million or 750 million euro tranche that's due maybe 1 month later, and it pays a little different interest rate. So, and that's fairly liquid. This is a lot of this stuff does trade and priced every day. So you're using that as a pricing proxy. Doing some adjustments for the little difference in interest coupons. And so we essentially say ours are going to be priced just the same as the comparable one minus the interest coupon adjustments. And then we back out the currency effects, because our loan is in DAI/dollars and these are in euros. So you've got these different triggers that are related to the underlying value of that collateral package that's in dollars, right? By the time we run it through the currency exchange rates every day, it's dollarized. And then let me think. The DEES group is doing this every day. They're checking the value. If it's above 120% coverage, they're still doing it daily, but they only report it to us once a week and show us the prior week's, daily results. If it's below 120%, they start performing it every day and showing us. I mean, they still do it every day, but they show us every day or on the forum. And then if it's below 115, it hits, what do we call it? Essentially a margin call. I forget the specific term, but where they have 5 business days to get it back up over 115. And then if they don't do that, it's going to be event of default, i.e., we can demand full payment. And if they 115, they have 5 days to get it back over 115, except if it goes below 107. If it goes below 107, it's event of default, and fully due and payable as well. And I mean, at the end of the day, what I would tell people is these are nice numbers to have, these triggers, but the SG Forge is a subsidiary of a single A rated big French bank. I mean, that's really who's going to take care of all of this and make sure it's not a headache to them. The only reason I think this ever really matters is if SocGen itself isn't fighting for its financial life. I mean, it's a single A rated entity. Not that banks can't blow up, but we work through all these mechanics, but all these mechanics really only matter if SocGen isn't in good shape to make sure all this works. I would keep stressing that point. So we're looking at an event that's probably 1 in 500 or something. So we blocked and tackled it to death, but it's a pretty small probability event.
Hopefully Dhruv, we answered your question on that one.
Indeed. Yeah, I didn't know about the risk report, so I will go through it. But yeah, it was perfectly explained in this comment about the nature of smart contract and the factory contract that basically deployed that contract. So it's also a framework called as CAST, which is another standard which is being currently developed to issue security related tokens. So yeah, this was interesting. A single, let's say, description that I go through from all of these discussion threads, and I wanted your feedback on that. Thanks,
Great.
Christian.
Thank you. Any other questions about SocGen? Eric, do you have anything else you want to add?
I think that's pretty much it. I mean, you can always reach out to us, on our handles and emails and on the forum. We'll be happy to discuss it in much more detail. But I think that gives a pretty good high overview. And then there's lots of little narrow paths that are fascinating. But ask us more if you want to hear about them. We'd love to talk about them. But again, most of them are conditional on SocGen getting in trouble, or this is all pretty plain vanilla boring.
And I would say that we had support of external French counsel on the transaction, and that was very helpful, particularly as we were trying to understand the issues surrounding the pledge and the just the overall nature of kind of this loan in France. Because what is interesting is it's called a loan for consumption, because it's a digital asset and they're actually viewing it as a consumption of Dai. So obviously they don't have to pay back the same Dai. It's Dai, but it's a particular loan under French law, which I'm obviously not a French lawyer. So we did have support from French counsel and SocGen's French counsel as well as we went through the transaction documents. Any other questions? None. Any questions about anything else? No. Okay. So, well, Will, can I hand it to you to close it off, or do you want me to close it off?
Yeah, no. If you can close it off today, I'm a bit out of voice there.
Thank you for everybody's participation. I'm looking at the number of participants. I know a couple of people have dropped off, but we had close to 18 at one point. So I think it was a very well attended meeting. So thanks to everybody who is here. And as Eric said, if you have any questions about the transaction, feel free to post them in the forum, or if you just want to reach us separately, you can do that. We're happy to do it. Either way, just recognize that your question may be a question that somebody else has as well. So, happy to have them in the forum, just so that we can respond to everybody and make sure everybody's up to speed and understands the deal.
Yeah, and one last thing as well, like, just want to recall the whole community that this has been a long process to get SocGen to this stage, and I don't want to jinx it, because we still need to have the final sign off on the dotted line. So I'll try not to jinx it, but essentially this has been a process that took up to, I think, altogether almost 2 years. So it's been a long journey to get to this point, and just happy to see that we're at the latest innings of it. So.
All right. Well, thanks to everybody, and enjoy your Wednesday evening, Thursday morning, whatever day you are. Enjoy your day. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.